Well, welcome to What Has the Environment Ever Done for Us? And we're a bit sort of happy with ourselves because we've come back after a long summer break, and we hope that you're having a nice time. I'm just recovering from the Labour Party conference and the Conservative Party conference, and if you think either of them was fun, I need a new definition of the word fun. But it was certainly instructive, and I didn't really feel that the environment was the biggest thing on the table, to be honest. But we'll surely talk about that as a team, as we're also now looking really close to this thing called COP26, which I find lots more people talking about, and still very few people know what it's about. So we've still got a purpose in life with our little show here, and we're very excited to have Chris Girdham from Corrie joining us. He's a friend of Johnny's. Everyone seems to be a friend of Johnny's, but we'll sort that out and ruin that for him when we get there. We've got the Professor Keith is back. His wife's out, so no tea or coffee being served. So that's really leveled up the panel. So
is that the new definition of levelling up?
Levelling up is the fact that we don't have, none of us are going to have cake and tea delivered to us while the webinar is on. And Jenny has got the nicest part to do is the interview, because we know that Jenny can't be horrible to anyone. So she's going to be lovely to Chris. So don't worry about it, Chris. Jenny's never said a bad word about anyone. Johnny's going to deal with the hypocrite, which of course he's not allowed to say because he works for Stantec and he's not with Kratos. So that's bad news there. And Vicky is going to try to be polite and not completely lose it over the hero. And in fact, I quite like the heroes that are possibly going to be coming up. One of them is standing up for his country, and I think got a great double act with a very elderly gentleman. It's great to see the young and the old working together on trying to help us all. So I think that's all very exciting. So thank you very much for joining us, whether you're joining us now or later. So let's go straight to Jenny. Jenny, would you like any help on understanding the background of your main guest who you're interviewing? No?
No, that's all good. That's okay. All good. I'll let Chris do his own introduction in a moment. But before we get into that, so Chris works for Corrie, who provide waste management services all across London. It's fantastic to have someone here to add a voice to the waste industry, because we've talked about lots of different pieces of the puzzle, different industries in the UK. We haven't yet had the conversation about waste. Now, there's some good news in the waste sector. So as of 2018, waste emissions were reduced by 63% below 1990 levels. So that's some really good progress in the waste sector. And they account for 6% of UK greenhouse gas emissions in total. Before we get into the sort of the meat of the discussion, Chris, it would be great to hear a little bit more about your background, about your organisation and what you do, really.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, thank you, Nick. Thank you, Jenny. I'll explain sort of my background first. I think that'll probably help people understand where I came from. So I have a background in town planning. So I started working in local government following graduation and moved quite quickly into consultancy and found myself working in the major infrastructure sort of space, supporting large telecommunications, energy, both conventional and renewable type projects. After a number of years of doing that, I moved into development management, initially with Ballymore, who some of you may be familiar with, and then I moved into private equity. And then early last year, I had the pleasure of joining Corrie as a development director. So it was an opportunity I really jumped at. So just a little bit of an intro to Corrie. So we process recyclable and non-recyclable waste for customers in London and the South East. So we're a large, as you mentioned, Jenny, a large waste management services business, but we're very much geographically focused on the Thames Estuary region. In the UK, at least, we're pretty unique because we move almost 90%, probably a bit more than that, of everything we do on the river. And we're able to move waste and commodities around the river using our sort of our four riverside waste handling facilities that are dispersed along the river from Wandsworth all the way to Tower Hamlets, and we've got other logistics facilities that support our operations elsewhere. And the purpose of that value chain is to move the black bag waste, or residual waste as we call it, to our energy from waste facility at Belvedere, which is in the London Borough of Bexley. We also operate a number of household waste collection centres and a pretty large materials recycling facility in Wandsworth, which to put things into context, enables us to process around 70,000 tonnes of recyclable materials that our customers bring to us. From a residual waste perspective, we're probably moving around 800,000 tonnes a year to our energy from waste facility, so that gives you an idea of scale. And we think, and we've convinced ourselves of this, that we move around about a third of all the tonnage on the Thames in any given year. So we're quite a big marine logistics operation. Last year, we were able to secure consent for a second energy from waste facility adjacent to our first, and Stantec were involved in that. And that, once we've sort of built and commissioned that facility, will probably almost double our operational footprint on the Thames. So it's quite a big transformational project for us. In tandem with that, we're also building, I'm just going to quickly touch on some of the big sort of CapEx projects we're working on, because they could probably quite help set the context for some of the stuff we'll probably talk about. We're also building with our partner Vattenfall, a very large district heating system, which will be anchored on our energy from waste facilities. And in the first phases, that is expected to support customers around South East London, Greenwich, Bexley, but it's being designed to be scalable, and and hopefully we'll be able to push that network into other London boroughs, and I think that's a really quite an exciting and major project for us at the moment. That's probably
No, that's
where we are. Yeah,
that's a really good background, really interesting, and you can start to even see how you're thinking about the circularity of the waste there and providing heat for homes, and that's really interesting. And what I thought I'd start with, before we go into a bit more detail about energy from waste and the projects you're working on, I thought we'd talk a little bit more about the waste industry, because it receives quite a lot of mixed, potentially bad press about sustainability of how we deal with our waste as a nation. So I'm going to cite one particular video which was made by Greenpeace. They've dumped a whole load of waste outside Downing Street, and the stats are quite astonishing, really. They say that the 625 kilos of plastic waste are sent overseas every 30 seconds. So we've obviously got some issues facing us in terms of trying to improve sustainability of waste. What actions are needed for the waste industry to continue contributing to our carbon reduction targets and meeting net zero?
Firstly, I think that advertising campaign was really trying to showcase or highlight the fact that the problem of us exporting waste to developing countries and dumping this problem onto to other societies. And I think, as a point of principle, personally, I think that's wrong. It's not something that Corey does, and I think there are good reasons to promote the management of waste that's arising in your community. I think it's why we are where we are. It's where we're situated in the Thames region, and where our customer base are built around us. So I think, as a point of principle, we should not be pushing these sorts of problems onto other societies. I think generally, I think in terms of what the sector could do, and the sector is a big, broad spectrum of different things, as you can appreciate. But I think you touched on it before, Jenny, that the sector as a whole has made quite big positive contributions to decarbonisation already. And the principal reason for that is we pivoted from landfill to energy from waste, 20 odd years ago. And that is the single biggest sort of transformative process that has occurred in the last 20 years. And that's really, really helped us to decarbonise faster than most other sectors. But I guess we still need to do more, and from an operational perspective, we're always looking at what else we can do, particularly around transportation and decarbonising transport, looking at energy consumption, water consumption, all of the usual things you'd expect us to be looking at. So I think that's a big. I think those are big important steps that we need to continue to take. But I think we haven't completed that journey, that transition from landfill to energy from waste yet. And I think we need to continue on that journey personally. I think both because it's best available technology, but the carbon benefits are measurable. So I think that's an important thing we should be doing.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you for explaining that, because I think there's a bit of misconception around the role of energy from waste, and particularly around sort of members of the public, there's a bit of negativity towards it as a technology.
Yeah.
Do you have any views on how we help sort of overcome the misconceptions and get the word out that energy from waste can actually contribute to our climate change action?
Yeah, I think part of it is it's just being transparent. It's basing your public statements and your engagement with people on science. I think that some of these misconceptions come from arguably from the first generation of incinerators. They were set up to essentially just dispose of the waste and just decrease its volume. They did it in a really hygienic way, but there were questions around their environmental performance. So I think that's where it started. And I think as regulations tightened up and technology has improved, energy from waste as a concept has just got more supportable, because ultimately it's producing electricity, okay, but that's not our primary purpose. Our primary purpose is to dispose of waste and do it in an environmentally responsible way, which I think we do. Abatement systems have improved. We're getting much more value out of that chain that you mentioned before. We're recovering a lot more commodities and materials. So we need to articulate that better to people and communities. We do what we can. We publish lots of data about our operational footprint, our emissions footprint. We have all sorts of outreach programs with schools and communities. And as I said before, we try and be transparent. But I think the industry as a whole has always struggled with that, with the identity problem.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting one in terms of, you were talking about that stemming from historic projects and actually that kind of overhanging now in terms of perceptions of the industry.
Yeah.
One thing,
and it's that perpetuation of some of these, I guess, these ideas around what we do. There are examples, we like burning waste, for example. We don't like burning waste. And the reason we don't like burning plastic. We do like burning waste. We don't like burning plastic. The reason we don't like burning plastic is because it has a high calorific content. And so what that means in very basic terms is it hangs around our facility a little bit longer than we need it to, because our job is to dispose of waste. So things like plastic, they dwell in your system longer and they slow you down, and essentially they're incompatible with your primary purpose, which is disposal of waste. And there are other consequential problems with plastic for us as well. There are other things like we disincentivize recycling. Well,
yeah, that's what I was about to come on to.
Oh, were you ready? Right. Okay. So that's sort of fatally undermined by what's happening in Europe. If you look at Northern Europe, Scandinavia, you look at all of the countries with the highest EFW adoption rates, they also have the highest recycling rates. So there's something else going on, and we think it's something to do with the way that our cities are constructed, where our buildings are configured, the shortage of the lack of the scarcity of land in our conurbations. There's something else going on, and behaviours. There's something to do with behaviours. So what you see is recycling is plateauing. And then the other misconceptions I've touched on it before is that our primary purpose is electricity generation, but it's not. It's a lovely, useful byproduct. But again, we don't. Our business model doesn't rely on it. Our business model relies on disposing of waste. And then there are questions and concerns around our emissions profile and the effectiveness of our abatement systems. And I know we'll probably come on to that a little bit later. So there are these things that we struggle with, and we struggle to proactively deal with them and shut them down. And I think we can, because I think evidence supports our positions on all of these areas.
Well, that's been really helpful. I think it's been very useful to explore different parts of the picture holistically about the waste industry and where you fit into it. So thank you for that. I thought we'd get, as you just... Oh, yes, Vicky.
Sorry, can I just, would you mind if I just come in on that? Because I think Chris made a really interesting point there about the comparison with Europe. I think the comment about building design, is that related to the way that we simply culturally we're not in the habit of separating waste, and whereas in Europe people seem to not mind having 17 different ways of getting rid of stuff.
I think there's,
is that part of it? Is it about the way we live our lives and not having space for bins? Is that what we're getting at?
That's definitely there's the physical structures of our buildings and our spaces and our systems and our collection methodologies. Because if you think, we have a dispersed network of collection organisations, we have a real kind of lack of homogeny in our building designs. We have all of these different things. And if you think, I'll try and give you an example that makes some sense. If you think, if you have some tower blocks, a cluster of tower blocks in the middle of a densely populated suburban area, it's very difficult probably for them to have a really coherent recycling strategy, because you have chutes, you have single point bins, you have a lack of asset management, estate management, you have all of these problems. And if you aggregate that up across a city or across cities, you've got a bit of a problem, which is going to have an impact on the effectiveness of your recycling, your ability to collect and sort and waste where it needs to be done, which is ideally at the front end. And then separately, you've got behaviours. So I think we've probably got to, we've done the quick win stuff. We've got to a level, and again, it depends on where you're on the UK, but we've got to a level where we've probably secured all the quick wins in recycling. It's now we're into the hard bit. So you also need to think about changing people's behaviours, training people to sort their waste before they dispose of it. But then also we've got to think about, what are there opportunities for more advanced separation technologies, and so there's a whole system of challenges, a whole network ecosystem of challenges that I think we're all wrestling with.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's also, in terms of behaviour change, there's also trying to reduce in the first place as well, because I know that one of the big cited issues at the moment is food waste, and the huge amount of waste from food systems at the moment.
And I think producers have a responsibility to look at packaging, and I think that's starting to happen, and there's a threat and the introduction of regulation, etc. But if you're manufacturing something, think a little bit more about what you're manufacturing, how you manufacture, how you disassemble and take apart that product before you dispose of it. It's little things like that, and I think there are some examples of really good practice. But if the more you do at the front end, the less we have to worry about the back end. I guess is a simple message from us.
And that marries very much also into, because we have a conversation about scope 1 and scope 2 emissions, and whose scope 3 emissions is actually somebody's scope 1 emissions problem.
And that is a huge problem.
Packaging.
Yeah.
When you look at the packaging, somebody is already creating scope 1 emissions in that packaging, which funnels through the supply chain and ends up as your scope 1 emission.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's something that, again, we need to sort of look at. And I think that the way that carbon accounting works in Europe and actually in other territories is slightly different, and it's more supportive of what we're doing as a, from a carbon reduction perspective. But we sort of seem to be burdened with everybody's carbon, and all the carbon accounting sort of falls against us. So there are some problems with the methodologies as well that we're not quite happy with.
And just to pick up on Vicky's question, and sort of your answer all around how basically across all local authorities, they all collect their waste slightly differently. You were talking there about some of the systemic issues or complexities around why it's difficult to reduce recycling, for example, in the UK. Do you have any thoughts on some areas of action which could help solve that problem?
Not direct measures, I think, because it's such a complex area, and I think we've got a structure in our conurbations, in our towns, in our urban structure. So only really for new developments where you can potentially start bringing in best practice and thinking more about waste management, waste sorting, and looking at particularly in London, because that's the context to which I obviously talk to and I'm most familiar with. If you're looking at some of the larger opportunity areas, the bigger master plans that are coming forward, maybe we should start thinking about waste management more, and that's an opportunity to do something at the outset in the design right at the outset of the design process. Retrofitting, going backwards is challenging and something I've not really thought about. But maybe that's an opportunity where we're really investing in big master plans, big urban regeneration projects. And that's maybe an opportunity for us to start piloting better practices.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And that retrofitting issue is definitely not something exclusive to the waste industry either. I mean, we've talked about energy efficiency of buildings and all sorts of other things where we've got that big challenge facing us too.
Yeah.
So one question I was going to ask you about was a little bit more about energy from waste technology. We're aware that obviously there are some environmental impacts associated with it. Some of the impacts include air pollution and pollutants. This is a bit of a challenge I know that you face. Do you mind sort of explaining that a little bit and how you kind of tackle that challenge?
Yeah, and I guess it touches on some of the points I made earlier about where the energy from waste sector started, and I think that we're still dealing with some of those legacy reputational issues. But today the energy from waste facilities, well, certainly the one that we operate, is a really highly regulated, quite a sophisticated piece of machinery. So we have really sophisticated air pollution control residue systems. So we're able to really deal with the really toxic, highly acidic residues that come from burning waste, and that residue contains dioxins, heavy metals. It's problematic. If you look at the overall tonnage and our overall value chain, it still represents a very small quantity in tonnage terms, but it's the dangerous stuff. It's the stuff that people worry about. So we're able to capture that in our abatement system within our facility. But then we have to prove that we're doing that. So we then certify the disposal of that segment of the waste, and some of it can be recycled. There is still value in some of that, but some of it has to be taken away for long-term storage and has to be handled by professionals who are competent in hazardous waste disposal. We also have something called a continuous monitoring system. So we're also monitoring in real time everything that's coming through our stack, and we're reporting on a monthly basis all of our emissions profiles to the Environment Agency. And I think we publish all of our data on our website. So we're just very transparent. That's what's coming out of our stack. Go and have a look at it if you're interested, or you're confused, or if you've got any questions or anything else. And then finally, there's an organisation called, and Johnny is probably going to be familiar with them, and you probably as well, Jenny, the Environmental Research Group. So they sit in Imperial College, I think, and they manage a network of air quality monitoring stations, which are situated in our locality in Bexley, but also further afield in adjoining local authorities, and that's accumulating data in real time. And we've, in all of these systems and all these monitoring processes, we've performed really well. And so we're well, everybody says this, but we're well below our, where we need to be in terms of emissions profile. So I guess the message is that we've got really, really robust and advanced systems in place, but also monitoring systems. And also probably the main point is we'll share everything with everybody. We share all our data. So, so I guess that's all we can do. We can communicate that, but I guess if people don't either understand it or don't want to engage in a more constructive dialogue, then there's not much more we can do about that.
It's quite an interesting one because of that regulation in place and because of all the monitoring you've got. I mean, I can think of lots of other areas where that transparency certainly isn't there.
Yeah.
And where, for example, we speak to lots of organisations who are only just starting to get their head around where their emissions are, for example. So hopefully we'll move towards that across the
I think
industry.
So. And we're trying to better it. So our second facility, for example, will be the cleanest in the UK because of the technology that we're deploying. There are others going to follow quite quickly behind it because it's the new standard, but we're always trying to improve upon it as well. And that second system will also benefit from this monitoring and regulatory system there.
Great. And I was going to ask. Oh, sorry, Johnny. You go.
So I was going to ask you that because for the waste sector, it really does lead the way, especially with things like emissions, compared to many, many other sectors. Is there future innovation here related to our net zero that really you guys is really exciting now? And is there anything there that is going to shape the way that the UK's emissions in general are and monitored?
That's an interesting point. I think some of some more novel technologies that we're starting to think about as part of decarbonisation, and these are ideas around carbon capture, for example. There are technologies that are, and I'm not, I caveat this, I'm not a chemical engineer and process engineer, but we're aware that there are technologies emerging that can actually contribute not only to taking out the carbon dioxide, the residual carbon dioxide, but also can do a little bit of positive work on the residual flue to actually improve everything. So there's some really interesting opportunities there, particularly for thermal combustion facilities that are candidates for carbon abatement. And I think energy from waste is an interesting one because, well, we're half biogenic, right? So our waste is about just over half biomass. So conceivably we can contribute quickly to carbon negativity, but we can also do a little bit more work, conceivably on our flue, on a residual emissions mix in our flue gas. But we can take the carbon out and some more and push that number below the line. And so there's something really interesting. For me personally, I like the idea of the whole concept around carbon capture and energy from waste, because it for pound for punch is quite a compelling idea. So I think that's where innovation could potentially really advance us, particularly if government says, look, we see it as well, we'll back you. And I know that, for example, carbon capture, it's looking at the clusters and there's finite amounts of money. But if you really want to push a technology that has real potential, then I think that there's an obligation to look at energy from waste and its potential to connect into carbon abatement. So that for me is an interesting area. And I think there are others in our sector group that are also looking at this and really interested in this. And we know that, UN governmental panel for climate change, I forget the name, you'll correct me, but they say the same thing: bioenergy, carbon capture, energy from waste. That's a really, really effective pathway to the 1.5 degree objective that we all are working towards, as does the Committee for Climate Change. So there's a consensus emerging that there's something interesting here, and I think that's where we can see some innovation and some really big material contributions to decarbonisation.
And I think on the issue of the innovations, the reality is with COP26 coming up, that actually it's the innovation that we're all desperately should be encouraging. What we're doing today is not sufficient, and without the innovation, we won't achieve what we've got to do in the future. So, I forget the government upset the whole of local government recently. Well, it does it on a regular basis because that's its job. But by announcing the state ownership or state system of our waste management, has that all gone quiet?
Well, we're not party to those discussions. We're certainly, we're in terms of looking at our next energy from waste, we're expecting to fund that ourselves. So if there's something that I need to be made aware of, then.
But there was certainly an announcement earlier in the year, but then with life at the moment, there were announcements every day of the week that sort of earth-shattering. But there was a totally unexpected announcement earlier this year that the government and the Department of Environment were going to bring in a national waste strategy. Yeah, which sent most of the waste authorities into orbit as they were suddenly looking at being dictated to by central government about the methodology of. So, Vicky, as a waste authority.
As a waste authority, and a meeting I had just this very day, we are just about to receive from our council the latest view on that. But like with everything in government, the Environment Bill has been delayed. Our latest understanding is that they were talking about pushing councils to 3 weekly refuse. They're now talking about potentially forcing councils to go back to weekly refuse collections, which is counterintuitive if you're trying to reduce, refuse. There is a promise that there is a suggestion that compulsory food waste will be there, including for people in flats, which goes back to what Chris was saying about the way that we build our homes. Free green waste for everybody. Again, where on earth is it all going to go? And there is talk about funding for councils to do that, but of course that's fine if you're going to provide capital for more refuse collection lorries and whatever, but unless they're going to increase the revenue support grants for councils, and some councils like ours are at neutral or actually paying into the pot, how are you going to pay the refuse collectors? How are you going to fuel the bill? Fuel the trucks? So it's still really difficult, and I know that councils are really worried. Over a third of the expenditure of a typical district council goes on their waste. A third of district waste, is madness. So a third of your council tax in your district councils is purely going to pass on to organisations to try and solve your problem. But Chris, I want to come back to another point you made, which has been bothering me. We've got the possibility of a new energy from waste plant in our area, and I'm fascinated by this. I've been to see a gaseous pylorification plant, and I just get super excited about it, which makes me very sad. But some of the objectors, apart from the we don't like burning, is if we reduce our waste year on year, which we have to, through reduced consumption and improved recycling, then potentially your raw material is reducing, but actually we tied into these very long-term, very expensive capital projects, which you then don't have a raw material for. Does that not see us risking you having to draw in, rather than sending waste abroad, drawing waste in? So at the moment you've got this lovely London circular thing, but if you've got to drag waste from Warwickshire and Newcastle, then it defeats the object, doesn't it?
Yes, it would. If I guess my view on that is that we're quite, our operating model is reasonably resilient, because a lot of our contracts are long-term municipal contracts, so we've got time to see things coming and to prepare, because we've got that stable business model. But I guess, and it will depend on the organisations, individual organisations. It will depend on the role of regulation, etc. Because I can't imagine ever there being a positive policy framework for exportation of waste. It's just becoming, or even the importation of waste is going to become challenging as well, because other countries are going through the same problems. They don't want to pass on their problems to other countries. So I think that will start closing down. So that movement of waste across international boundaries will probably settle down a bit. So in terms of the gap, well, we don't see the gap arising that quickly. We still see those big structural challenges. I think they're quite difficult to overcome, and they may take decades. And we're probably going to need, some really big step changes in technology and behaviour, and all those things I was talking about before, for us to sort of really close that. So we don't see materially the amounts of residual waste coming to us dropping that much. It might plateau. It might drop a bit as we make some incremental improvements in recycling, but we don't see these big steps, these big changes in the short term, at least.
And in relation to that, and there's a behavioural piece here that's so similar to other types of carbon emissions. Let's talk through that behaviour change part of it, because ultimately we're a very wasteful society. It's frightening how much we waste, and frightening how much we don't even think about how much we waste.
Yeah, I agree.
Earlier, it's just scary, but that's us. That's all of us. We're all contributing to this society that just consumes. And a colleague of ours, Ron Henry, always talks about temperance. I won't do it in his accent, but do we have to get to a society where essentially we have this level of temperance, where we just stop consuming this locust? Is that the ultimate point?
Yeah, it's at what point do we get that awareness, that consciousness? And I think we're some distance away, from a societal perspective, from getting there. It's not urgent enough. Because whilst it's it's counterintuitive that we would be saying reduce consumption, stop pushing plastics our way. But actually, there's an argument that as a representative of my community and blah blah blah, and thinking about my kids, we should be reducing consumption. We should be thinking more about packaging. We should be being much more resource efficient at the front end, where it's easier. Actually, it's much harder to do what we're doing. Try and sort it all out and separate all those atoms out. It's just much easier to do it at the front end. Is I guess my message.
And there is a point where we've just also talked about the planning system, and the planning system is about to be watered down, I think, and forgotten about and pushed to one side because offending everyone. But in the planning of new housing, in the retrofitting of new housing, two very big issues that are currently out there. We should be designing in waste disposal, waste management from day one. And I don't think it is built in the way that it needs to be if we're going to get that shift in attitudes, because each community should be asking how it is dealing with its waste and what it needs to take into account in its local plan.
Yeah.
The most wasteful thing is actually its local plan, because it takes years to decide where they're not going to build houses, and it drives me insane. But it's not. That would actually be a really interesting question for people to say, well, actually, how are you dealing with the waste of these new homes, and how is that going to be built in? Otherwise, we'll be talking about systems that were set up in the 1930s, and the only time ever on a planning committee I've heard waste described is, oi, can you move the cart around when you get it down that cul-de-sac? You know, and then suddenly there were rulers coming out to work out whether you could got the turning circle of a dust cart. But otherwise, that was the only time I ever heard waste come into the conversation.
There's one example I'm aware of, what was really good practice, and I'm not close enough to the scheme, but at Barking Riverside, I know they're looking at some really innovative waste collection and distribution systems. And I haven't really got close enough to it, but there are some really clever ideas coming forward. But I guess you need everybody to be thinking in the same way and doing the same thing and moving at the same pace. But that is one project, I'd be remiss of me not to mention it, that is starting to think about it at scale.
Nick, can I just come back on your comment about planning? So one of the things which I find fundamentally unfair when it comes to planning and waste is your waste collection as a residential customer is one of the fundamental things your council tax pays for. But if you are living in a development where the municipal refuse collections can't get down that cul-de-sac, that landlord will quite happily make an arrangement with a private company and then put that on your service charge. So you're paying twice for something, which is completely outrageous. And I've actually objected to planning applications in my own ward on the basis that it's fundamentally unfair to those residents to pay their council tax for something which they're not getting, and then pay their landlord because the landlord, you know, is trying to overdevelop the site. And I think we've got to think about, you know, there's so many bits to this jigsaw puzzle that actually, you know, what's the point of having, you know, this is the fundamental thing your council does, and then not making the system work so that it works. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I do, and I think that there's also, I totally support that in the injustice there. I also think it's very interesting in the councillors making decisions how little they think about the waste, because apart from road sweeping and clearing the drains, you are one of the process of moving the waste from our homes and moving it somewhere where it's not offending anyone, like appearing in the oceans from different parts. Is one of the main services, but very rarely do councillors ever ask questions about waste. You know, I worked with a lovely lady who used to always ask an architect, and it was wonderful to see an architect cry, have you got enough space for the bins, dear? Because in Kingston upon Thames we have 7 receptacles, and you see instantly an architect die a million deaths as they going, I'm not actually sure whether I've done that calculation. So I'm quite interested how we embed that in the way that we're building new homes or creating space. Keith, you've been very quiet. You're obviously missing Mrs. Keith.
Yeah, well, I have been fascinated by the conversation, and it's been making me think about the complexity of you start talking about the waste sector. And then immediately you're talking about, well, the implications of that for energy generation and the upfront manufacturing issues, and then the way in which that's dealt with in the supply chain, and then people's personal behaviour and the way you design places. It suddenly becomes this hugely complex system that you need to start thinking about and trying to unpick. And that is actually a bit of a theme for our headlines slot, as it happens, Nick.
Well, you know, if you wanted to give Chris a little bit of a moment to relax, and Chris, you know, if you feel like butting in like the others have done to you, just get straight in there. Don't hold back. But Keith, would you like to move into dealing with our headlines and taking us?
Yeah, I'll definitely do that. And part of the problem with trying to do the headlines slot is this time is we've been off for a few weeks, haven't we? And so much has happened. So it was a bit difficult to know what to pick. But I've gone for the trio of the energy crisis, the Insulate Britain action, and the fuel crisis. And I'm going to try and whip through those very quickly and just sort of pull a few sort of common thoughts together at the end. Now, the thing about the energy crisis is that, curiously, part of the problem that we're facing is that we've made such good progress in decarbonising the energy grid. So at the moment, something like 50% of all of the CO2 reduction in the UK so far since 1990 has come about as a result of decarbonising the way in which we create energy. And we've moved from something like 40% of our total energy generation being by coal to less than 1%. And on my mobile phone, I have a little app that tells me, what our energy on the grid is currently being generated by. So I can tell you at 2:00 this afternoon, we were generating 50% of our energy by gas, 13% by wind, 11% nuclear, 6% solar, which is quite a surprise, I think, 6% biomass, less than 1% coal, 0.2% by storage, Johnny. We need to get that storage number up. But it's fascinating, isn't it? Despite the fact that we've decarbonised very significantly, 50% of our energy is still being generated by gas, and that's becoming more and more entrenched. And it's becoming more entrenched because we've got a bit of a dodgy nuclear system at the moment with old nuclear power stations that are getting shut down every now and then. The French have had to shut down their energy supply that we've been sort of taking from them because they had a bit of a fire. And simply over the summer, we've not had enough wind. So we're really reliant on gas. And in this process, we've also then, China has decided to sort of refuel itself and get its economy going again. Their gas demand has gone up. Russia has decided, well, we don't want to fill the gap for the Europeans. Why should we save them? Because we actually they want to build us a new gas pipeline. What's that? The Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline. John, you probably know all about that. So they think this is a good bargaining chip. We'll let the Europeans really suffer, and we'll see if they'll let us build this pipeline. And so what happens? Not enough gas to go around. Prices go up, and down goes the energy market. Quite a number of energy suppliers that have gone bust. Some commentators says there's only going to be 10 of them left. There won't by the end of all of this. There won't be that competition in the market and pressure down on prices. And there'll be impacts on industry. Apparently the steel industry is now switching its plants off during peak energy times because they don't want to pay the power during those periods of high prices. Chemical factories closing down, manufacturing being quite impacted. So, there's a real potential impact on the post-COVID recovery as a result of all of this. In other news, Insulate Britain. Everybody must have heard about Insulate Britain. They've been making headlines by closing the M25 down. And what they've been trying to do is to get us to use less energy. Well, that would be a good idea, wouldn't it? So setting aside for a moment the legitimacy of whether or not you either support or deplore their action, what they're actually demanding is that all social housing should be insulated by 2025. And that a plan should be made within 4 months to insulate all homes by 2030. And I don't think that's particularly controversial because at the moment, 15% of all of the carbon generated is coming from heating our houses. And if we're going to meet the requirements of the Paris Agreement, we've got to get that down by 78% by 2035 and down to net zero by 2050. And we don't have a plan. And in fact, that plan seems to have been sort of put back and put back and put back. So it's not, that's something like 1.5 houses a minute that we need to insulate, but between now and 2050. So what are we going to do about that? And talking about not having a plan, we have the transport industry creating a real furore by ignoring the fact that we've got an aging HGV driver population. We've had that for years and years and years. I used to work I was the director of the Sector Skills Council called Go Skills, and we had a lot of dealings with the logistics industry, and they were talking about this years ago. And so, that has been going on for years. Even before Brexit was real concern about,
I totally agree with you, and I'm only butting in because I didn't butt in earlier, so I thought I would. But the issue that's really frightening me is the New Labour, which I'm just watching a fascinating TV series about Tony Blair and Gordon Brown. They bolt from going ahead with nuclear. They started the indecision.
They also balked at going forward with road user charging at the time.
But Ed Davey told me that one kettle was possibly enough at the wrong time to take out the whole energy grid, because it was very witty for him to say that when he was the Secretary of State. And it was true. We'd got very close to not having enough peak energy. And he was, Secretary of State in 2012? So we are now getting a series of political figures that have not made the argument. Now, that's great for me to say that. But when we get back to climate change, which is COP26 coming up, we are living with a political cohort that have known the problem is staring in the face for X number of years and haven't had the bold decision-making to put in place the solution. And the solution to COP26 has got to be decisions made now, and they haven't done very well on our energy. We do not have energy security in this country.
Yeah, well, the point that I was coming to is it was exactly that, because just finishing the transport point, and I'll come back to you, is that what happened was that you end up with a shortage of drivers. And it's one of those incremental things, slowly, but then don't quite have enough to get to all of the fuel stations, and a few people go, there's a little bit of a gap. The media come in and, pull the chain, and overnight, fuel sales went up by 80%, almost doubled overnight as a result of that. You can see, I've got the graph, you can see the graph just goes like that, completely off the scale. And so what was a tiny little problem became a huge, great big problem. And that's the political problem. The systems that we operate are acutely fragile. There's something like the UK stores about 1% of the total European gas being stored. We have about 2 or 3 or 4 days of gas that we store in the UK. We've got no flexibility at all. The same in terms of our fuel deliveries, and as climate change progresses, and the turbulence increases, so these shocks will get more and more.
I think that's absolutely right, and it's something that I think the Deputy Mayor of London told me last year, that for London to not fully recover in its foot traffic, if it is down by 3%, that is sufficient in economic terms to bring a cold economic wind through the streets of London.
Yeah,
this is where the politicians are missing it. They think, we close down the whole of London, that's bad. But actually, you're talking about 2 or 3% in these very finely tuned economies, and that is enough to cause an absolute disaster in all sorts of areas.
Yeah, and my sort of closing point would be that the people who will end up being at risk of really suffering at the end of that are the most vulnerable groups.
Absolutely.
And so you do begin to find it incredible that the political class does not see this coming and take action about it. And just coming back to Chris for a moment, I was really interested in the idea about waste retrofitting. We've also heard about the proposal to put EV charging hubs in all homes, all new homes. What about retrofitting existing homes? And what about the water companies retrofitting water-saving devices? All of these things. So rather than just talking about Insulate Britain, why aren't we talking about this whole retrofit plan that's necessary? And it comes back to that systems thinking and making the absolute most of every penny we spend trying to address some of these issues, which we need to get on with, don't we?
well, Keith was so quiet earlier, and now he's
now I can't stop.
He's calling us to arms. We're going to be out there. All I can say is, if you want to know where the M25 is going to be blocked, follow Miss Venables, the reporter for the LBC, when she gets up in the morning, because she's about the only person who knows where they're going to go next. And I'm not saying that LBC are a naughty broadcasting organisation who then go and complain about people protesting. But never mind. Keith, I think you've been a barnstormer. The summer has been good for you. It was fantastic. All those issues, and I think that they're the themes that I think that we should start to challenge. The COP26 is very, very important, and these decisions cannot be fluffed any longer. And our politicians of all political creeds do not have the best track record when you look at energy, the energy sector, and how they've managed it in their time and where we are today. So I think it's a really important thing in the retrospect. We're going now to Johnny. I dropped you in it, so I'm terribly sorry for anyone who was offended by this section about hypocrite. I'm really sorry about what that's done, and so.
That's all right. Don't worry, and there's nothing wrong with a little bit of hypocrisy, but I got stuck in trying to work out what the difference between irony and hypocrisy was. So actually coming up with something to say is stymied a little bit by my lack of brain cognition between those two words. But I did like earlier in the week, actually, was it this week or last week? I can't remember. All the days merged into each other. The ironic statement of the week were the headlines when the energy crisis kicked in and the 2 fertilizer plants had to shut down, and we saw that pure CO2 that went into food and packaging, which is really, really important. The headline was, "We ran out of CO2," and I thought, that's a really strange. That was the strangest headline I've seen in the last actually this year, actually. But no, that's not what I'm going to say. My irony or hypocrisy. I don't know where to kind of land the hypocrisy. So maybe it's just irony. Obviously, going up to COP26, going to see lots of people up there, really excited. I think it's going to be a fantastic 2 weeks. And booking our travel plans straight onto the rail to see how much the cost was. Oh my God, quite expensive. Return ticket, £189 in standard class on the Rocky train all the way up. 7.5 hours, I think it's going to take me. And in the Google search, as it popped up, was the flight. £60 return. Business class, £120 return. There's something wrong here, isn't there? That the sustainable mode of transport is going to cost me more than a business class flight up to the same place. And there's something came up this morning. I don't know if you saw in Austria. They've implemented a climate change strategy with regards to public transport, and you can get a train journey anywhere for €3. And the way that they've done that is there's a hugely subsidised rails. And I know there's people are putting asks in of government to pay for everything when it comes to climate change, but it's very well funded. You pay a lump sum up front, and that gives you access to these €3 charges, and you can travel everywhere on the rail system. So there's just something there that needs to be figured through. It doesn't seem right, does it, that it's cheaper to fly than it is to catch a rail? Very simply, price on carbon would probably fix that, wouldn't it? So that things like the price of carbon, bringing that into investments and payment decisions is going to make enormous difference to the UK. And again, COP26, we just need to get on with that, don't we?
We do, and they're talking about they've done lots of deals behind the scenes. So expectation management is a little high. I'm really expecting some big announcements. And Vicky, you've got heroes.
I know, and I normally get the bad cop slot, and I think it's today I get the nice ones, and actually this is so I've got 3 contenders for our heroes this time, and I'm actually not going to go with the one that you think I'm going to go with, but my first one, I don't know how many of you watch Good Morning Britain. It's far more pleasant now that Piers Morgan has gone. But Laura
Let's
Tobin,
not be controversial here.
No, exactly. I can't. Even with the heroes, I'm controversial. But the weather girl for Good Morning Britain, Laura Tobin, lovely girl. It's her birthday this weekend. But last week or the week before, she spent a week presenting from the Arctic. And what I found really fascinating about that was she dealt with the alleged hypocrisy of going to the Arctic to talk about climate change. But the reach of that programme is massive. And I, as you know, did a climate course last year, and it took me ages to get my head around the ice albedo effect. She managed to nail the ice albedo effect in 30 seconds on breakfast TV. And I think that's what we've got to get to with the climate agenda, is people that are totally accessible while you're eating your cornflakes, explaining something that's incredibly, knife-edge stuff without it feeling preachy. She just looked the part, she sounded the part, it was so blooming obvious. You're like, what? So she's up there. Linked to that, you've got obviously our future king, Prince William, announcing the Earthshot Prize in conjunction with everybody's favourite David Attenborough. I mean, if you don't love one or the other, there's something seriously wrong with you. And I think the idea of them working together on something, again, it's breaking through to people who might not be very attracted by Greta Thunberg or Extinction Rebellion. It's like, hang on a minute, this sort of safe demographic, you're going to be attracted. And one of the things that Prince William said, which relates back to Chris, is that the waste of one process must be the raw material of another. So I think he's given you the carte blanche for energy from waste for the future there, Chris.
Yeah.
But the winner of the hero of the month, I'm sorry, I've gone for a different winner. Google. So Google. I'm sorry, other search engines are available, but Google have come up with a new method. I use Google Maps all the time. Other maps are available, but if the rest of them can come up with this, that'd be great. From next year, you'll be able to put in the lowest carbon route for where you want to go. It's available in America now, comes to Europe next year. They reckon it's going to save 1 million tons of carbon dioxide by actually people being able to choose the lowest carbon route. And the other things they're doing within that, their programming, is that they're going to be showing the carbon footprint of flights in their search engine for flights and the sustainability levels of hotels. Again, it's getting it through to every time you put something in, that it's in your face. So that only came out a couple of days ago. So as much as I love the other three, I thought that's a game changer for me. So
and the fact that Google have all these computers that are running on high electricity, running all the time to keep it going, we're not worrying about any of that.
They have committed to.
Is that not an issue? I'm the numpty in the room, so obviously, look,
they're going fully renewable.
Chris, thank you so much for sharing what Corrie do. It really is an important thing that a business thrives because we need you to innovate, we need you to lead, we need you to create solutions that we don't even understand at the moment. And I loved personally that you're building your second incinerator, and that's going to have technology that wasn't available for the last one. You were telling us it's part of your DNA to improve and move things on, and that is so important that people hear that, because we don't have all the solutions today. So thank you so much.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure.
Chris, I'd love to come and see it, because I've got a thing for these waste plants.
You're very welcome anytime. Yeah.
And we're
that's all of you. Please do come and look. It's we will accept that offer.
And Keith, we've missed the wife, the tea, and the cake, but fantastic. We've missed you a bit, firing all four cylinders. Johnny, thank you so much again. Jenny, lovely as ever. But Stantec and Kratos are putting this together, not just because we love all being together, and I do absolutely love being with the gang, but these are really important issues. They're professionally important to us all. It's part of what we do every day. It's over and above sometimes what some of our clients want from us, but it's important to us that we bring forward the ideas that we do. If you are watching this at home and you want to take part or you want to contribute, please go to the various websites. Kratos and Stantec have got great websites, and you can also see everything we've done up to now on our YouTube channel. So with that, thank you so much. And COP26 is coming, and we're still not got all the answers that we want. So we'll be here next month asking even more difficult, annoying, if not funny questions. Thank you.